Good morning. Last time we started to talk about labor demand elasticities, and as we said that this chapter is divided into three main parts. Part number one is about own wage elasticity. Part number two is about cross wage elasticity. And finally, part number three is about policy applications, or in other words, effects of minimum wage law. We talked last time about own wage elasticity, and we said that own wage elasticity is calculated as percentage change in employment divided by percentage change in wage rate. The value ranges from 0 to infinity. If it is 0, this is perfectly inelastic demand. If it is less than 1, it is inelastic. If it is 1, this is unit elastic demand. Greater than 1, elastic. And finally, infinity, perfectly elastic demand. The sign stands for the relationship between wage and the employment level. And as we said, based on demand or the law of demand, there is a negative relationship between wage or price of any commodity and the quantity demanded of this commodity or the employment level. So we are going to neglect the negative sign and take the absolute value. And based on the absolute value, we are going to determine whether the demand for this product or this factor of production is elastic or inelastic demand. Also, we talked about Hicks-Marshall laws of derived demand. And as we said, that the own wage elasticity is going to be higher under four different conditions. Number one, elasticity of the product, elasticity of demand for the product itself is elastic. So own wage elasticity is going to increase or to be, or the demand for employment will be elastic as well. Number two, when other factors of production can be more easily substituted, so the availability of substitutes means that the demand for this factor will be more elastic. Number three, when the supply of other factors of production is more elastic, supply of other factors of production is elastic, so demand for this factor will be elastic. Finally, number four, the proportion of or the share of money spent on this factor compared to the total cost. Share of this factor from total cost. The higher this share, the more elastic the demand. Cross wage elasticity. Cross wage elasticity is the elasticity of demand for input J with respect to the price of input K, or it can be calculated as percentage change in employment of input J due to percentage change in wages or price of input K. So in case of cross elasticity, you would like to study the relationship between two different inputs, quantity of one input and the price of another one. Just like on wage elasticity, the value ranges from 0 to infinity. If it is 0, so it is perfectly inelastic, less than 1 inelastic, and so on. But here we have to differentiate between positive value and negative value. If we calculate the cross elasticity and the value is greater than 0, or it is positive, this means that the two inputs are substitutes for each other. If you calculate the own wage elasticity and it is negative or less than 0, so the two inputs are complements for each other. So here we have to divide the value to two main parts. Number one, the sign, and the other one is the absolute value. Sign stands that whether they are substitutes or complements. In this case, it's negative, so they are complements. And the absolute value will help to identify whether the demand elastic or inelastic. In this case, the absolute value is 1.5, which is greater than 1, so it is elastic demand. Do you think the law of derived demand or the Hicks-Marshall law can be applied to cross elasticity? The answer is no. As in case of cross elasticity, the scale effect and substitution effect work in opposite direction. So the law of derived demand or Hicks-Marshall law is applied only to the own wage elasticity. It's not going to be applied for cross wage elasticity. Now let's move to the last part of this chapter, which is effects of minimum wage laws. Minimum wage law means that the government would like or is going to set the wage rate at a minimum level that no one can get any money below this level. So let's start with the theoretical analysis of the idea of minimum wage rates or minimum wage law. The main concern about the minimum wage law is that applying minimum wage rates will reduce employment level to the targeted groups. According to economic theory, minimum wage rates can be expected to reduce employment opportunities for the least skilled workers, least experienced workers, if the demand for labor is elastic. So in case of elastic demand for labor, applying minimum wage rates will only affect the least skilled workers. Why? As elastic demand means that percentage change in employment is greater than percentage change in wage rate. So aggregate earnings of low wage workers could be made smaller by an increase in minimum wage rate. So if the government is going to increase the minimum wage rate, so the aggregate earnings of low skilled workers is going to decrease. But here we have to differentiate between nominal and real wages. Minimum wage rates are set in nominal term. So this means that if prices are expected to increase or at a higher price level, the actual value or the real value of minimum wage rate is going to increase, as real wages is calculated as nominal divided by the general price level or any indicator for the general price level, such as consumer price index or GDP deflator. Now we would like to make an expectation about how minimum wage rate will affect the employment in a country. Witnessing an expansion, economic expansion, do you think minimum wage rate has no impact on this country, or it will affect employment level in this country. Assume that in year one, two things happen. Number one, minimum wage rates increase to W2. So that we have to differentiate between wage rate in year one, sorry, in year zero and in year one. In year zero, wage rate is W1 over B1, which is equivalent to W node over B node. But in year one, wage rate increases to W2 over B1. So the ratio W2 over B1 is greater than W1 over B1 or W node over B node. The second thing that happened during this year is economic expansion. Economic expansion led to an increase in demand for low-skilled labor or workers. And this is going to cause a shift for the demand for labor curve to the right. So let's start with the initial situation, graphical. This is the employment level. This is the real wage rate. Demand for labor, D node, at, say for example, this level. Wage rate is W1 over B1, which is equivalent to W node over B node. As in this case, we are going to assume that wages and prices are going to change by the same amount in the same direction, so which means that there is no actual change or modification in the real value of wages. Now, as we said, that there is an economic expansion, and as a result, demand for low-skilled workers increase, and the demand curve will shift to the right. So we have a new demand curve. And at the same time, the government would like to increase the wage rate, the minimum wage rate, from W1 to W2 with no change in prices. So in this case, this will be the minimum wage rate, W2 over B1. So E node is the employment level in the initial situation or in year zero, and E1 is the actual employment level in year two. Actually, E1 is greater than E node. This means that minimum wage rate has no impact in this case. But actually, this is not true, as if the government hasn't decided to increase the wage rate from W1 or W node to W2, the employment level should be E1H. E1H is what ought to be if there isn't any increase in the minimum wage rate, just an economic expansion in the country. So there is a loss in employment due to the application of the minimum wage rate or increasing the minimum wage rate, which is equivalent to the difference between E1H and E1. So this is the loss in employment due to increasing minimum wage rate from W1 to W2. Actually, the idea of minimum wage rate is not applicable in all countries to all sectors. So we have some covered and some uncovered sectors. So we would like to study how minimum wage rate will affect employment in both sectors, whether covered or uncovered sectors. Here are two panels. In the left-hand side, it is the covered sector. And in the right-hand side, it is the uncovered sector. This is the demand curve for the covered, and this is the demand curve for the uncovered sector. Now let's start before applying minimum wage rate, or when there is no minimum wage rate, and the wages in this case will be W1. Sorry, W0. So this is employment, the initial employment level in the covered sector, and this is the initial employment level in the uncovered sector. So total employment in both sectors will be E0U and E1U. Now, the government is going to impose or apply the minimum wage rate in the covered sector. As a result, the wage rate in the covered sector will increase from W0 to W1. So this is W1 is the minimum wage rate. As a result, employment will be E1C. So there is a loss in employment, or employment in the covered sector decreases from E0C to E1C. Those workers who couldn't find a job in the covered sector will try to find a job in the uncovered sector. As a result, wage rate in the uncovered sector is going to decrease from W0 to W2. So employment in the uncovered sector will increase from E1U, from E0U to E1U. So employment in the uncovered sector increases by the value E1U, which is calculated as E node U plus the difference between E node C and E1C. So E1U is the initial value of employment in uncovered sector, and the difference or loss in the cover plus the difference or the loss that has been occurred in the covered sector. This is the end of our lecture today. Thank you and see you next week.